don't we get started? I'm Michael Bellicosa, Head of Adult Programming here at Wilton Library. Welcome to tonight's session. It's going to be another great lecture and discussion with points and questions and comments raised by all of you, as well as a presentation by Mark. Hope you enjoyed the book, if you had a chance to read it, or if you're going to read it after this. I'm going to skip the intro because we all know about Mark at this point. The one thing I'll mention to you is the current plan, just so you know what we did this past summer, is the fourth and final session, if conditions stay all favorable. Mark will be here in the library in the Brubeck Room giving his lecture. We will point the camera at him, and so it still will go out over Zoom. But if enough people are interested and the conditions are good, we'll have it in person in the Brubeck Room, followed by a little wine and cheese afterwards to have a little chit chat with each other. So that's just a heads up to think about. That will be the final session. And after next week's session, I will send an email to all of you, and you can just let me know, yes, I would come to that, or no, I'm just going to watch it on Zoom, and then we'll take the planning from there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and the program.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Let me say that if you've been with us since the very beginning of these three series on 20th century American novels, starting with The House of Mirth, you know that this is the 10th of 12 that we've been doing. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, 1943, just 3 years after Native Son. And when Michael and I were discussing this series back in the summer, I said that I thought of these four books. I mentioned this last time briefly in pairs, Native Son and A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. You could not find two more radically different examples of realistic fiction, and that they were both American novels out of a city experience by writers who wrote about some aspect of their own background, much more so, of course, with Betty Smith, and that The Catcher in the Rye and On the Road would be good paired examples of books that challenge the notion that America is inclusive of all its people, and we'll turn to that next time. So I told Michael that what I want to do tonight is something I've done with some of my college classes, and it comes from this past summer. A librarian wanted me to do a lecture on a book that had the sea as its theme, and this was going to be in the summer, and wondered whether I would be willing to do Moby Dick. And when it was pointed out that this lecture would be maybe 75 minutes in July, I suggested that I didn't think people would cotton to wanting to read that epic book or reread it for a single session of 75 minutes in July. And so I said instead, what about The Old Man and the Sea? And this very good librarian said, well, isn't that a high school book? And I pointed out that, yes, it is often taught in high school because it's short and it is not allusive to other mythological, historical things. It has a kind of compactness. But just because it's taught in high school doesn't make it, quote unquote, a high school book. And I raised that this evening because I think there might be people who would look at these 12 books, taken the three series together, and say, which of these things doesn't belong here? And it's true that you would not find today, I think, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in a typical American literature or English course in college. You would find it in high school. Indeed, I think you would find it in middle school. Maybe not so much these days because it's not quite as multicultural as the 21st century is. But certainly over the last 40 or 50 years, this is a book that would have been taught to middle schoolers and high schoolers. And what I'm proposing is, instead of doing this with a group of all of you, some 60-something strong, I'm going to do it with me as the teacher and me as the student. And here's the exercise. If we were hired, that is this class, and for the purposes of this example, it's me and me, by a public relations firm that was trying to pitch the idea that A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is not just a kid's book. It is very much a book that appeals to children. Many people that I know that I've talked about with this about this book, including every one of my private book groups, including some libraries, talk about how much they love this book as a very young person, sometimes not much older than Francie. How might we pitch to someone that it's a mistake to think about this as a kid's book? It's sometimes what people say about To Kill a Mockingbird. They love it, they admire it, but they don't think it's tough or complicated or modern. We don't need a scholar to come talk to us about To Kill a Mockingbird, or maybe Catcher in the Rye, or as I said, The Old Man and the Sea, or Of Mice and Men, or The Grapes of Wrath, which we did earlier in this series, or Silas Marner, the one George Eliot novel that has made it onto high school syllabi because it's fairy tale-like and it's short, atypical for a Victorian novel. So that's what I propose to do. I'm going to make a defense, question and answer, of the status of this book. I'm first going to tell you something about statistics. So she wrote this book in 1943, her first novel. Her dates are 1896 to 1972. She gives Francie, Betty Smith does, she gives Francie her birthday in December, but she makes her a little bit older so that Francie is born at the beginning of the 20th century, quite intentionally. The first version of this novel was a play called Francie Nolan and a short story named Death of a Singing Waiter. I've always found it interesting and not surprising that the novel would have begun with the daughter and the father, and that the daughter would be named and the father would be generic, Death of a Singing Waiter. The manuscript that she submitted had to be edited down to half its length. So if you enjoyed reading this book, you might regret that half of it lay on the editor's floor. If you found it daunting to get through it, you might be relieved. It sold 300,000 copies in 6 weeks. That's 50,000 copies a week, which is 10 times the weekly number that would make a book a New York Times bestseller today. A phenomenal success. It was made into a movie 2 years later. And when you know that Hollywood, in the form of 20th Century Fox, with the director Elia Kazan, made a novel into a movie 2 years later, that is, they began it a year later, and it came out in 47, you know it's a big deal. They bought the rights for $55,000 in 1946. That would be nearly $900,000 today. $900,000 today. And although she went on to publish other novels, none of them had the critical or commercial success of her first novel. She said famously she wished she had run her career in reverse, so she would work up to the big time. The movie was an enormous hit. Peggy Ann Garner, who played Francie, won an honorary Academy Juvenile Award, and James Dunn won Best Supporting Actor for playing her father. It was turned into a radio play in 1949, a Broadway musical in 1951, a TV film in 1974. So that attests to a kind of success, but that doesn't mean that someone would say, well, this is a book worthy of college study. You could say the same thing might be true of the musical Annie, that's a great hit and very popular, but doesn't have the substance. So one thing I want to say is it's a mistake to think that a novel or any work of art, but we're talking about novels in this series, achieves its greatness because it's difficult or cryptic. I appreciate that sometimes I'm brought in because I, from my study or my experience or just my interest in trying to make things accessible to people, I might see something that you don't, and of course that's important to me. But I don't think all literature, and not even the modern novel, has to be difficult or cryptic for it to be great. Literature can do many things, including recording what is realistic. This is a much more realistic novel than, for example, Native Son. And not just because it's likely closer to many of our experiences, whatever age we are, wherever we grew up, than Native Son is. Native Son is, as I said last week, a novel of ideas. This is not a novel of ideas in the same way. And although there are naturalistic details in this novel, that is not just realism, but that people are beholden to certain natural forces of economics or sex or family or genetics. Alcoholism is very much associated with Irish Americans and not by stereotype. There is a genetic reason for that. Naturalism says, in its extreme form, people like Zola or Theodore Dreiser, that we are slaves of these larger forces in this case, the American culture that individual character cannot withstand. Think of American Tragedy, Theodore Dreiser's great masterpiece, or Sister Carrie, and Zola is even darker. There are naturalistic elements in this novel, but it's not a naturalistic novel. It is very much a comedy, where of course Native Son is a tragedy, and the comedy has to do with, first and foremost, that it's a coming of age story. So one of the things we might do if we were in a class, but again, I'm going to do it solo, is say, well, it's a coming of age story. What do we make of that? Well, one standard kind of novel is what was called in German the Bildungsroman, because it was associated with the 19th century, an education novel. The 19th century was very interested in Europe, England, and America, with the idea of education and progress, human beings taking their fate into their hands. And many novels, whether we're aware of it or not when we read them, are coming of age stories. Just to talk about three American novels, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a coming of age novel. To Kill a Mockingbird, Huckleberry Finn is 1885. To Kill a Mockingbird, 1960, is a coming of age novel very much. Catcher in the Rye, which we're talking about next week, 1951, is an anti-coming of age novel. Instead of the protagonist coming to an understanding of his, in that case, place in society, instead that person rejects society, as we'll see. So that it's a coming of age novel means that we might think of it in terms of a genre rather than just, oh, it's a moving story and it's sentimental and comforting and it has a kind of charm, a word that I don't think of as denigrating, but you don't hear it brought up often in conversations about interpreting literature, that this book has a kind of charm. But charm is a high value in my world. I admire people who have it. I have moments of charm from time to time. Part of the allure of the novel that has nothing to do with its charm is that it's a coming of age novel and things are written in sequence, which is also often not true of modernist novels. It has a beginning, middle, and end in that order, which is one of the things that gives a satisfaction to many young readers. It's also a subset of a coming of age novel, another German word, Künstlerroman. Roman is the German word for novel from our word romance, a made-up story. And Künstler is the German word for artist. An artist novel is a subset of the coming of age novel, the education novel. Classic examples are always include James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, 1916, and later in the century, Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel, 1929, which Betty Smith read and very much admired. She was a great admirer of the works of Theodore Dreiser and of Thomas Wolfe. She had some of Thomas Wolfe's romanticism and lyricism. She had a little bit of Theodore Dreiser's naturalism and determinism. You know, the Nolan boys, the four Nolan boys, they're doomed. The four of them are all dead well before 35. Only Johnny lives long enough to have children to marry and have children, a family that he can have no responsibility for. One of the things that Francie has to learn in the book is how can she unite her father's dreamy, romantic lyricism. He loves beauty, never gives up those studs. They're buried with him, even though they would pay for several meals or months' rent. How can she marry her father's feckless romanticism with her mother's clear-eyed pragmatism? And she does it by becoming a devoted writer of made-up stories that are not completely made up, this perfect amalgam of writing about what she knows. And that teacher, she has a nurturing art teacher, a nurturing music teacher. Her English teacher, not so much, won't call on her because she looks indigent. And part of what Betty Smith conveys in those episodes is that that teacher probably is not so far removed from the impoverishment that marks Francie. And part of the psychology of her not calling on Francie is that Francie reminds Mrs. Gardner of where the teacher has been. And she has succeeded in getting out of that world by turning her back on it. And in turning her back on it, she forgets what a teacher should do and doesn't try to bring Francie along with her. And Francie is clear-eyed and adamant about not playing that game. And when she finds out that her stories are being denigrated for being sordid, and the word sordid means filthy or dirty, and she knows how clean her family is. Her mother is a janitor. Her father dresses impeccably when he's in his singing waiter mode. She has to find a way, Francie, to unite the steeliness of the Romilly women with the love of art and beauty that her father represents. And those of you who read the novel know that it's not schematic. I'm breaking it down into its components, but you don't experience it that way. It's like many, many families, the children share in traits of the mother and father, and often have to make a choice of a vocation based on which way they want to go. So very much an education of a writer book. We read one of these this season, this Call It Sleep. Henry Roth's 1934 book is itself a Bildungsroman and Künstlerroman. All Künstlerroman, all artist novels are educational development novels. And it has a lot in common with this book in other ways as I continue to tick off some of the subgenres. Very much related to the education of a writer is this book, this novel, is a celebration of books and education. Mary, like Betty's own grandmother, and Betty is not Irish American, she was Austrian American, and her parents came from Austria, and she converted the story to, I think, an Irish American family to make it more broadly accessible to people. But the immigrant experience in many ways is universal, especially to people who are experiencing it in Brooklyn or New York or other urban environments. So the celebration of books and education by a writer, a young person who comes from a background of disadvantage or impoverishment, is part of what makes America America. It is an American success story, and that's another kind of genre. It's a particular kind of success story because it's also a novel of immigration, like Call It Sleep. In 1910, just around the time this novel is set, 15% of the American population had not been born in the United States. 15% of the people living in America in 1910 were not born here. Nearly 14 million of 92 million. And this is very much a novel about being in an insular world where you're an immigrant, but you're not the only kind of immigrant. The book opens with tensions between Catholics and Jews. Francie unknowingly uses insulting words about Jews. It's possible Betty Smith had some of that as well. Not surprising in its day and age. But that immigrant society is not the American society. And to succeed, you have to get beyond the neighborhood. And that brings us to another aspect of the novel. If we were in a group and we were pitching ideas, someone in my class might call out, well, it's very much a novel about family. I did this very week in New Haven, a private group on the Brothers Karamazov, all 850 pages of it. And one of the things I talked about is that it's a family novel, not only because there are 4 brothers, 3 of them legitimate, 1 not, and a father, and I won't say anything about the plot, but if you've never read it, you owe yourself that favor sometime. So when you have a couple of months with nothing to do, read the Brothers Karamazov. But that's a family novel, like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or like Little Women, or Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, or to go to our own reading list, The Grapes of Wrath, that we read earlier this calendar year. And part of that gives it a different status from just any work of literary realism. Native Son is not so much a family novel. One of the problems that Bigger has is he doesn't have a family in any way that we would recognize as helpful to his development. And even though Francie has a mother who is clearly not supportive of her, and she knows it, it's not just that the mother doesn't love her equally, Francie. The mother lets her know that in a way that is just not motherly. But luckily she has aunts, and especially Aunt Sissy, who becomes a kind of surrogate mother. Holden Caulfield and Bigger Thomas do not have that advantage. This is a family novel. It's also like Call It Sleep and like Native Son, an urban novel, a novel of the urban landscape. And that's worth thinking about when so much of American literature plays on the notion of town and country, or the great American wilderness, the prairies, the idea of manifest destiny or westward expansion. What happens to the American dream when you're no longer in a position of adventurous enterprise, one of the terms used in the 18th century about combining the spirit of the explorer with the experience of the entrepreneur? How can we go west and also make money? Oh, there's gold, there's furs, there's mapping, there's taking over territory. One of the things that her grandmother wants to make sure that her daughters and her grandchildren know is that it's important, Mary tells Katie, that the children have a sense of the supernatural, ghosts and fairy tales. It's important that they have an education and read or be read to in the 2 most important books, Shakespeare and the Bible, that is How to Live Right and How to Write Well. But it's also important that they have money and know how to get land. That combination of literature and imagination, not even tied to literature, like ghosts, believing in ghosts, and the practical reality of money and acquiring land. So when we run out of urban novel, family novel, immigration novel, the different kinds of education, we can come out the book in another way, which I'm going to do in my second unit. But now that I see that we are where we are, I've used almost half an hour, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. And the question I'd like to put to you, and once again, I will take other questions later, but to keep the flow of my lesson plan going, I'd like you to say something about the question that I put before us. What is it about this very readable, enjoyable, for many people, emotionally satisfying book that also makes it great literature? And I say that not because a book that does those first things has to be great literature, but it is. And I put it on this reading list because this is a course in great American novels, and I think we can defend that. So if anyone has anything to add And in the interest of time and the numbers of you, you're up to 70 now. If you could be brief, what is it about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn that you think qualifies it as a work of literature and not just a good read?
Well, while we're waiting for a couple of comments, I'll just make one comment myself. And first of all, we actually had a couple of comments of people relating this to Call It Sleep, so I'm glad you got that, worked that in automatically. Um, and also that book had a lot of modernism with the stream of consciousness aspects and the phonetic writing of dialectic dialogue
And the symbolism. Remember, we talked about the coal and the cellar and the train and the glowing, the sleep.
Yeah.
It's loaded with symbolism that makes it clear this is not just about the story of his life. This is about something else, capital S, capital E.
Right. So here's a comment. This novel about a young girl is great literature because of its layers of meaning and subtlety. Not just about a little girl, more like Charlotte's Web, but so much more feelings and self-awareness and learning.
Yeah, I want to say that it's hard to put your finger on it, hard to put one's finger on it, but one of the things that makes the movie, the novel remarkable, like Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, is that the artist, the author, has made this incredibly believable young girl in limited circumstances who just takes your breath away as being inspirational and limited in her world, and believable. And one of the things that literature can do that makes it literature, even without symbolism or convoluted modernism. I'm not running down modernism. I'm a modernist instructor, but it can capture the realistic effectively. It can tell a story that's believable. And even if we didn't know that many of these details come from Betty Smith's own life, like Francie, she knew she developed that habit mainly from being lonely, from being gifted and lonely, of paying attention to her own childhood and filing experiences and places and people and episodes away to refer to later on. That's the kind of thing that takes a gifted child who's also spends a lot of time with herself and with reading. And rather than just become despondent or bookish in an anti-life way, she becomes someone who puts into her own book the life that she led as a lonely, not wholly loved, seeking for love. And certainly Francie tries to do that when she gets old enough to be interested in men. She admires that her Aunt Sissy, that surrogate mother, is healthily hungry for men. She admires her independence and her carnality. That's a remarkable thing, to be able to create a young girl, anybody, but in this case, a young girl like Francie, a young girl like Scout, who is both remarkable and believable. Because everyone in this Zoom room or this long distance room knows that the world is filled with unbelievable true people. That we all know people who seem too good to be true, who are impressive, like people out of a made-up story, who actually exist. And it's one of the great blessings of life. And one of the things that literature can do is represent such people in fiction.
Great point. And I think it also relates to something that Harold Bloom used to say more than once, that one of the reasons you read is because you don't have enough time to meet so many people.
Exactly right. One of the things that literature does is it allows you to interact with imagined people, not imagined characters, but imagined people. I taught a course for many years in libraries called Imagined Women that did a continuing series of novels where possible with a woman's name as a title, like Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, Jane Eyre, and so on. And what is it about the novel that convinces us that this made-up person who's only a font on a page is actually a woman in all of her complexity? And some of it is getting right the psychology, the sociology of the day. This person's moving in a world that is believable. And some of it is, how do you get insight into that person's interior life? And to go to Howard Bloom, and he praised Shakespeare for creating, as he said in the title of his book, The Invention of the Human. How do we get to know these people from the inside out? And we realize that even though this room is filled with 70 people, and I am fairly sure that all of you are real, except for Michael and maybe a few people in the audience who have been acquaintances of mine, I will not know any of you anywhere near as well as I will know Francie Nolan. And Francie Nolan is not real, and you're real. And the difference is that I don't have, not that I don't have the time, I don't have the access to know you the way literature can know you. But a talented writer can give me Francie Nolan 360 degrees. And even if the novel is not literarily complicated in other ways, and even if we throw out the list of subgenres that I've given, the novel is a success because it makes this remarkable girl real from the inside out.
Great. Got a couple more comments. I'll just
Okay.
run through them. One person says, it is a great novel because we remember it. I read it 75 years ago and it has lingered inside me to this day. And she then adds essentially, and I'm hoping through this session to understand why.
That may be more than I can do, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in that comment, and I appreciate it. Another kind of greatness in literature, and I mainly teach books that are in the literary canon, and I got my experience as a student and as a teacher in having what I hope is a talent for making hard to understand things more understandable. But the book groups that I've been doing, 4 or 5 private groups now for 30 years, one of the things they like every now and again is to read a book that is not complicated or hard, to read a book that has a beginning, middle, and an end. This book was sent out as a pocketbook to soldiers overseas. Pocketbooks had been designed in America based on Penguin's English model to fit in the pocket of the uniform of servicemen so that they could read it while they were at war, a pocketbook. And in fact, the pocket in uniforms were called pocketbooks on the model that it was a pocket that could hold a book, like a map book or a notebook for taking down details of a military operation. And the publishers had the insight, again, first designed in 1939 before the war, but hundreds of thousands of these books were sent free of charge to American servicemen. And imagine being abroad in the Second World War and having this experience of reading a charming, engaging book about America that even if you're not from Williamsburg, not Austrian American or Irish American, you had no siblings, you didn't have an alcoholic father, you're going to find something in this book to love. And one of those things is the women. And I'm going to get to that in the next comment I make, because whatever your experience is, every soldier has an experience of important women in their lives. And I'm not talking sexually or through marriage or romance. It is a remarkable thing to be able to construct a world that our commenter a few minutes ago says you can remember for decades.
Yeah. Okay, I read the book and I liked it a great deal. Although I wonder if it belongs with Steinbeck and Fitzgerald. Could you compare this to Anne of Green Gables I wonder why A Tree Grows in Brooklyn belongs with great literature and Anne of Green Gables is just a story for young kids.
Yeah, well, all I can do is say this is what I've been trying to do for the last half hour. Maybe it's not taking. Maybe it's not taking with the questioner. Maybe it's not taking with anyone. I've got some more time. I'm going to give it my best shot. I think of this as a masterpiece in a way that I don't think of Anne of Green Gables. Some of that's a matter of taste. But your question coming at 7:40 goes to the heart of what I've been trying to talk about for most of the session. So I'm going to return to that. In addition to those genres, one of the things that makes this book striking is that it is loaded with important women characters in a world that is loaded with feckless men. Not only the Nolan brothers, but Romilly's husband and the successive Johns that Sissy has, and Evie marries a man, Willie, whose last name is Splitman. What could be more perfect? And turns out she has to take over his jobs when he's not able to do it. Katie is a janitor, not a cleaning woman, not a maid. She's a janitor. And one of the best lines in the entire novel is when she realizes that she cannot depend upon her husband to support the family. And it says about her at the end of book 2, chapter 11, if you're in this version of the book, it's page 95, but if you're not, it's near the very end of book 2, chapter 11. She exchanged her tenderness for capability. She gave up her dreams and took over hard realities in their place. Ladies and gentlemen, how many people, and not just American immigrants, but for the purposes of this novel, how many people who, now they're born here, her parents, but people come from immigrant stock who had to realize they had to give up tenderness for capability. That is, she loves her husband, but she can't depend upon him, so she has to take care of the family. She can't afford to send both her children to school, so she not only sends Neely because he's the favorite son, it may not be coincidental that he looks like the father, because she knows Francie well enough, and this is another version of a mother's love, not tenderness, but clear-eyedness. I know that Francie has a spirit that will propel her forward, even if I don't get her into school. Francie will take care of herself. Neely, even though he's strong and big, and Francie is small and kind of feeble in stature, I know Neely's going to need that help. So how many people, and especially women, had to exchange tenderness for capability and had to give up dreams for hard reality? I don't mean that men have not done this too, but we only have the novel we have. And in this novel, the peoplescape is filled with ineffective, dreaming, sometimes alcoholic men. I mean, the fate of the quartet of Nolan boys sounds like a parody, but unfortunately, we know that many, many families were beset by familial genetic alcoholism. And he takes on a job that keeps him around alcohol all the time. He turns over his wages to his wife, but he keeps the tips for drinking. And he's constantly around drinking, and he drinks, he says, because he knows he wasn't bred to have a family. It doesn't make his daughter love him any less. And we all know that kind of relationship where she partly loves that he gives her world something that the mother does not. Song and style and romanticism, where the mother is worlds away from that. But that line, exchanging tenderness for capability, really stuck with me. So one thing that makes the novel great, I think, is it creates these believable women in Mary, in Katie, in Sissy, in Evie, of a constellation of forces very different from one another. Some of them might move into stereotype, but I think most of them are credible, that form a kind of nurturing opposition and tension for Francie, who needs somebody like Sissy to have a different model from her own mother. And again, I think many people who come from families, smaller or larger, have had that experience, that thank God for aunts and uncles, thank God for family members who are not actual family members, but old friends who are treated as aunts and uncles, cousins. And certainly part of the immigrant experience is that notion of the breadth of the family. Katie prides herself on not taking charity, but the saloon owner helps her by hiring her children. Michael McShane rescues the family, and the novel ends on the eve of Katie's next wedding as a new page in the family. Neely and Francie will remain Johnny's children, but Lori, born after her father dies, is going to be Michael's daughter. And there's a kind of second chapter for Katie, which this novel is not going to show us. That's why it ends. There's a lot to be said for the architecture of that arc, and also for the idea that this novel does a phenomenal job of creating a realistic depiction of a truth about life. That is, that people, not our mother and father, often have more of an influence on our nurturing. So I'm going to now, as I'm winding down, to leave time for questions about anything at the end, not just what I've shoehorned you into, is to look at something that she does artistically that I think she does throughout the novel. I'm going to give one example. If you have the book with you, I'm looking at the last page and a half. Again, if you're in this edition, it's page 490, 91, but in any edition, the last couple of pages has a short paragraph that begins, "She stood before the mirror in her white slip." Again, this chapter begins on the eve of Katie's upcoming wedding. We've seen rites of passage. This is chapter 56, which begins Saturday, the last Saturday in their own home. So a completely realistic sense of transition. We opened with a Saturday. We opened with the notion of how important Saturdays are. And unlike that clanging alarm clock that opened Native Son, this begins, serene was a word you could put to Brooklyn, New York, especially in the summer of 1912. Somber as a word was better, but it did not apply to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Prairie was lovely, and Shenandoah had a beautiful sound, but you couldn't fit those words into Brooklyn. Serene was the only word for it, especially on a Saturday afternoon in summer. So it begins with a Saturday. Don't waste your time looking for the word serene in Native Son, in Catcher in the Rye. So we're here on another Saturday, and we're told she stood before the mirror in her white slip. As she curved her arm over her head in washing, she remembered how she had sat on the fire escape when a little girl and watched the big girls in the flats across the yards getting ready for their dates. Was someone watching her as she had once watched? So she's looking backwards and she's looking forward. She remembers when she was a little girl looking at older girls like her, and she's trying to imagine as now she's that older girl, the last Saturday in her old home, is she being looked at that way? So instead of continuing to look at the mirror, an image of self-reflection, you can't write an autobiographical novel without looking at yourself, your past, your character, but it's also an image of vanity. You can't write a novel about the world if all you look at is a mirror. So what's the next paragraph? She looked towards the window. Yes, across 2 yards, she saw a little girl sitting on a fire escape with a book in her lap and a bag of candy at hand. The girl was peering through the bars at Francie. Francie knew the girl too. She was a slender little thing of 10, and her name was Florrie Wendy. That is, she's looking at a different kind of mirror. She's looking at the version of herself that the novel began with. She was 11, this girl is 10. She's Francie, this girl is Florrie, a different kind of mirror. But this mirror, looking out, not looking at yourself, is how novels get written, is how people grow up. Seeing the world through your own lights by looking at the world is where education lies. Francie brushed out her long hair, braided it and wound the braids around her head. She put on fresh stockings and white high-heeled pumps. Before she slipped a fresh pink linen dress over her head, she sprinkled violet sachet powder on a square of cotton and tucked it inside her brassiere. That is, she's growing up. This description could be her dressing for her own wedding, for example. She thought she heard Fraber's wagon come in. She leaned out of the window and looked. This is the hallmark of this end of the novel. She's not just going to stay looking at herself in a mirror. Yes, the wagon had come in, only it wasn't a wagon anymore. This is that same notion that that was then and this is now. It was a small maroon motor truck with the name in gilt letters on the sides, and the man making preparations to wash it wasn't Frank, the nice young man with rosy cheeks. He was a little bandy-legged, draft-exempt fellow. The world has changed. She looked across the yards and saw that Florrie was still staring at her through the bars of the fire escape. Francie waved and called, "Hello, Francie." "My name ain't Francie," the little girl yelled back. "It's Florrie, and you know it too." Francie is not mocking the girl. She's living the moment as recognizing that she is seeing herself now as she was then. "I know," said Francie. She looked down into the yard. So notice, she leaned out the window and looked. She looked towards the window. She looked down into the yard. Again, you know the world by looking at it. That's what David does in Call It Sleep. Bigger does not look at the world this way. He doesn't have that freedom. The tree whose leaf umbrellas had curled around, under, and over her fire escape had been cut down because the housewives complained that wash on the lines got entangled in its branches. The landlord had sent 2 men and they had chopped it down. So again, that was then, this is now. Change. She's not being hopelessly sentimental. This is an unchangeable world. Things change. But the tree hadn't died. It hadn't died. A new tree had grown from the stump, and its trunk had grown along the ground until it reached a place where there were no wash lines above it. Then it had started to grow towards the sky again. This is not nuanced. This may be too heavy a symbolism for many people. It's certainly not subtle, but this is a novel about aspiration and determination. The tree will find a place to grow. Annie, the fir tree that the Nolans had cherished with waterings and manurings, had long since sickened and died. But this tree in the yard, this tree that men chopped down, this tree that they built a bonfire around, trying to burn up its stump, this tree lived. It lived, and nothing could destroy it. Once more, she looked at Florrie Wendy reading on the fire escape. "Goodbye, Francie," she whispered. She closed the window. The end of Native Son, the last chapter, begins with the clanging of the metal door of his prison. Francie is going to leave this home to go to another home, and she's going to be a success. So she closes the window because she's done for the moment looking at the world of the street and of Florrie and the fire escape along the way. She can always go back to it. The window is one of the things that's going to make her a writer. But for now, she's back to the safety of her house and her preparing to get dressed as a little girl now who wears a brassiere and a pink slip. That page and a half is remarkably well done. And although it's a long time since I read Anne of Green Gables, I'm not sure there's anything in a lot of kids' books that can compete with this. And so I would defend, and I'm happy to be a majority of one, that this is a great American novel for several of the reasons that I've tried to outline in the little bit of time I had tonight. And now, Michael, I'll turn it over to you for other comments and questions from the people listening to me.
Sure. Well, we had a couple of questions slash comments about the symbolism of the tree, and I just want to. One of them includes a couple of interesting details for people to hear about, and then you can react to it. This person wrote, "I love the symbolism of the tree in the title. The species in question is the ailanthus, essentially a weed, a non-native invasive tree that can endure very harsh conditions, which is why it can grow out of sidewalks in Brooklyn. What a better symbol for Francie, who endured tough conditions to survive and excel."
Yes, thank you, and all true and all worth noting, and I appreciate that comment. That is, it's not just an abstract symbolic tree. It's a native tree. It's a tree that has a name. It's a tree that I am all but certain Betty Smith encountered in her own youth. Other comments or questions, Michael?
Actually, one back to your first break. Person has written, "I'm not sure it is great literature, but I would say that its power lies in the evocation of a world through remarkable details."
Yeah. So I want to say that, again, I'm happy to agree to disagree. I think people sometimes think that what makes literature great is it got a kind of unique status. And I do think many people think that part of its greatness is its toughness. You have to really work at it. Certainly, The Brothers Karamazov is not an easy novel to read. Faulkner is very difficult to read. But when we talk about imagination, we forget that one of the ways that imagination works is remembering. If I were to ask you at this moment for everyone to remember something from their childhood, or easier, remember something that happened to you this week. Try to remember the details, the picture, the scene of something that happened this week. That remembering is an act of imagination. I don't mean you're making it up, but you are putting an image, you are imagining, composing a scene that doesn't exist anymore. You're not there, it's not before you. You have to recreate it. And if your challenge is not just to remember it, to recall it, to imagine it, again, I'm not saying it didn't happen. Something that's imagined doesn't have to be false, it just has to not be present. If in addition to imagining it, you have to tell it to someone else and convince them that it's believable, evoking turns out to be high art. And I think there's a greatness in literature that can bring back the past in a way that millions of people have said, "I know what you mean, Betty. I know what you mean." And to me, that's the grandeur of the novel.
I think
will
that's
say that I do think the tree imagery tends towards the sentimental, but it comes early and late. It's there throughout the novel. They don't hit you over the head with it. I think the fact that Katie has a gun and wounds the rapist who is going to assault Francie might be a little melodramatic and might be on the border of marring the novel. But look, she's written more novels than I have. I've written none. I let it go. But when I ask myself, what is the tree that grows in Brooklyn? The tree are the women. Francie is going to be sheltered not by that tree outside the fire escape, but by her mother, who, even though she doesn't love her in one way, loves her well enough to help her get by and to know her daughter well enough to know she doesn't need the kind of help that Neely knows. And there are many parents in this audience tonight, and I'm sure many of you know that one of the ways you can serve your children is by knowing them. Even if, and no one's going to admit this, you may not love them as much as another child that you have, to know a child so well that you know that Francie will thrive, even without a father, even without the mother's love that she gives to Neely, even without an early education and a good school, there's a kind of love in that knowledge of your child. Sissy is filled with love and compassion. And despite her sexuality, she's somebody who wants to be a mother, fails constantly at it, but gives maternal love to her niece. And I think one of the things that competes for the notion of what's growing in Brooklyn is that family tree that is populated by women. John Updike, who I've never much cared for as a novelist, but love as a book reviewer. I have all of his prose pieces where he reviews other books. I think he's a wonderful writer. Said in one of his reviews, if life is a forest, women are the trees. If life is a forest, women are the trees. It's the trees of women in Updike's view, in my view, through the lens of this book, that nurture families into success. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. Really interesting. I hope you all enjoyed it, folks. And we'll see you next week for Catcher in the Rye. Good night,
I'll be
everybody.
here. Thank you. Stay well, everybody. Thanks again for attending.
Thanks, Mark. Good night.